Welcome back to Spotlight. I am delighted to delve into literature today with writer E. Burke. Welcome, E.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. Virtually, of course, which is kind of sad because this has just well, you probably not just, but has written two books that are very close to my heart because they are about, one is about Tom Sawyer and one is about Huck Finn as adults. And she will be speaking at a virtual panel with Rebecca Floyd at the Twain House on February 15th from 7 to 8 o'clock. So people, you can go on to marktwainhouse.org to get your registration, et cetera, et cetera. But so it is free, but nobody minds if you make a little donation. So this is just fascinating. And those two boys in literature are just about the most interesting boys in literature, really. Friends, but very, very different. And their two books are the adventures are different. So tell me, how were you introduced and what drove you to take this any further?
Wow. Okay. So everybody I know has stories about how they were introduced to Mark Twain. And, mine are probably not a lot different than a lot of people. I read those adventures when I was in school several times, read them when I was younger, then I read them when I was in high school. And, they just resonated with me. I love those stories. And I grew up in a rural area of Florida. And while that isn't exactly Missouri, there were some similarities culture-wise, so there were things about the things that they experienced and the boyhood of Tom Sawyer and the boyhood of Huck Finn that just reminded me a little bit of other boys I knew and the area that I grew up in and my own tomboy self, because I was a big tomboy. But they were just kind of woven into the fabric of my childhood, kind of like old friends.
Yeah.
And, years later, as I was kind of, reading the books again, I was thinking, I wish I knew what happened to them. Because you don't know, Twain didn't tell us.
Right.
I always loved the way he could tell a story. My grandfather, he loved Mark Twain too. And he had a very similar kind of sense of humor. And I think that sort of, that just kind of, I love that kind of quick-witted, always speak your mind, be a little bit, kind of a little bit cynical.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so when I began to look at writing my own stories and storytelling, I kind of looked to Twain for guidance too, because I love the way he was able to capture, place and personality and the dialect and all of that. So, and then, the more I learned about him personally, the more I was interested in his history and his life and read a lot more books about his life. And then yet that informed these books as well. So the reason short answer, started writing about these characters was probably about 10 years ago. It seemed like every author on the planet was writing a romance based on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
So true.
And there are many, many, many of them out there. And I was talking with some friends of mine. My critique partner said, well, if you were to write a derivative fiction, something, a spinoff, who would your main character be? Who would your person be? And I went, Huck Finn.
Yeah.
And she just looked at me and just started laughing. And after we both stopped laughing, I said, no, I'm serious. I think that would be so much fun to write. And she said, well, why don't you?
Yeah.
So I did. And it took me a good 10 years to write these books.
Did it really? Wow.
It did. I wrote them and then I rewrote them and I rewrote them and polished and rewrote. And these books took a lot longer probably than anything else I've ever written, just because I wanted them to be right. I wanted them to be the best I could possibly make them. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to put the time and effort into them and make sure they were there before I published them. So,
well, in a way, it's almost like you had big shoes to fill, because these boys who are so full of character, they needed to be just as interesting. But I love how it's completely believable that these are the adults. And I was reading and I was forgetting that it wasn't Mark Twain writing about these boys that he loves so much, which was really fun. And especially, I don't want to give any spoiler alerts, but, Huck becoming a river pilot. I was like, oh, that's perfect. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah, and it really was fun that when I began to think about the books and kind of how they fit, what I wanted to do is almost pretend, what if these were real guys? What if
Right.
Twain was writing about his contemporaries? Because he kind of was. He's
Yeah.
writing sort of in his own past and about contemporaries of his,
Mm-hmm.
peers of his,
Yeah.
boyhood friends. Well, what if these people really existed? In what period of time would they be? And that's sort of how I began to kind of develop the stories about them, because I sort of placed them in a period in history that would make sense for his peers to be in, where he was, in the 1870s,
Mm-hmm.
and as a young man. And so that's kind of how I fit them into a place in history. Tom's story comes a little sooner, comes during the Civil War, largely because as I began to kind of look at how I want to tell his story, I really gravitated toward the idea of, why Becky Thatcher? Somehow I knew in my head he was going to end up with her.
Yeah.
But I was like, well, maybe, I don't know. Why Becky Thatcher? I didn't like her very much when I read the book about her. The little girl, she's so spoiled and naive and so clingy and, all these things for me anyway, I was like,
Mm-hmm.
But then I began to kind of study the Victorian women and just sort of the ideal of Victorian women, even Twain's ideal. If you read about kind of the way he even views his wife sometimes, is from this very idealistic perspective, women to be protected, women who are weaker,
Mm-hmm.
than men who are more fragile. Although at the same time, I think he's very quick to admit they're not as fragile as you think.
Yes. Yeah. He admired the strength, but he put them on a pedestal and didn't want them to be I won't say real, but yeah, he put them on a pedestal.
Yeah, very idealized.
Yeah.
Well, what got me to thinking was, a young woman like that, this only child of the judge, this older man and his wife, and she's very spoiled and pampered. What would happen to her if she's in the middle of the war in Missouri?
Right.
A horribly divided state.
Yeah.
It was under martial law. There were terrible things going on up and down the river. What would that do to a young woman like that?
Mm-hmm.
And especially if she's thrown into some real danger when her father gets arrested as a traitor.
Right.
What would happen? Well, it's either going to break her or it's going to make her.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was sort of got me going on the whole storyline. And then how does Tom come in? And then what happens when he comes in? And of course, everything he touches is going to get into more trouble. So, so it was really fun. It was really fun.
Yes. Becky's very empowered. And I have to admit, as I was reading it, I was thinking about that old TV show, the Wild Wild West, where that's what it was like, from out of the frying pan into the fire, and one thing happens and then another, but it's all believable because it's Tom Sawyer and he attracts trouble in a way.
Yeah, he really does.
Yeah.
And what I realized very quickly as I got into these books was I have to create a backstory for all these people that doesn't exist really.
Yeah.
When you read Twain's books, there isn't a ton of backstory about these young men. There isn't a lot of backstory about the characters that he puts in those books. They're just there.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was like, well, who are these people? Who's this brother of Tom's? And how did he get in the picture? And they're half brothers. And why does Tom hate him so much? And why was he a tattletale? And what happened to him? And so it just, and who's related to Becky, and where did Jeff come from? And, so how were all these people playing into the story, and what role do they have when they're adults? What happens? These friends, what happens to these people? Yeah. And so that just kind of got the ball rolling, and even to the point of what was going on with regard to slavery at the time.
Right.
And people, kind of spiriting slaves away over the river. And of course, at that time it was over the river, they had to get them across the river to get them to freedom. Yeah. And so, so it was, it sort of, I was sort of forced to create this backstory for all these people within a historical context.
Sure.
So,
wow.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Quite
really
a job. That's a lot of research. Now, so Huck Finn's book came first. And it's perfect. Taming Huck Finn, which it would be impossible most probably, but I haven't gotten all the way through the book.
Yeah.
And you've you've couched these under sort of your title, The New Adventures. So are there more to come?
Well, I'm hoping,
Yeah.
perhaps. What I haven't decided is sort of, do I continue on with their story, or do I continue on with stories about the people around them? And so some of it's going to be kind of, I think, based on how much interest people have in these books.
Right.
And also, because I have many, many books I could be writing. That's the thing. It's kind of like, which one do I want to pick next? Because I have so many ideas, I can't probably possibly write them all.
Right.
But yeah, it opens the door to further adventures,
Sure.
Whether they are together or maybe the people around them.
Right.
That have adventures that then they can be part of.
Yeah.
So it opens the door to a few more books. I just haven't decided precisely where I'll go yet.
Exactly. Because you have many places to go. E has the Steam Romance and Rails series, and also American Mail Order Bride series. And even though we're focusing on Twain and the February 15th event, I want to hear a little bit about those two. How did you even start making all these series?
I know. It's funny. People ask me about a lot. I kind of told you where the Twain thing came from. My historical romances are mostly from history, to tell you the truth. I'm fascinated by history. I love American history, and in particular, the period of the steam railroads and the period of Western expansion. When America was kind of moving westward.
Right.
And so that period of time, I like that period of time. When I began to really write a lot, people were like, well, write what you like, write what you know. And I'm like, well, what I know is where I sit right here in Kansas and Missouri. I've done a lot of research in this area, and it's a fascinating period of history out here. So I started, thinking about a kind of a westward expansion series, if you will. And I was kind of, playing with an idea about a railroad race. And people had done the Intercontinental Race. Well, I came across one that was across Kansas that was much less known, but just as interesting. And so I began to research that, and it just got more and more interesting to me. And about the time I started working on that book, it was funny, the series Hell on Wheels came out. Okay. If you remember that series, that TV series. Well, it really reminded me a lot of what I was working on. And I'm like, oh, well, good. The people are enjoying this. There's a TV show about a big railroad race. Maybe they'll enjoy this series, So the series is very much steeped in the historical expansion of the steam railroads. And in particular, it follows two railroads. The first book follows one of them that loses the race. And then the other three books and beyond follow the second railroad who wins the race, and to go on to other things that get in its way, And so each book has its own sets of characters, and that's kind of, it's a kind of exciting. There's a lot of suspense, and that, like I said, the historical underpinning of everything. So they probably qualify more particularly as Western historical romance. What people would call Western historical romance.
What fun. And it does, from the little bit I was able to kind of look into, your women are strong. You're not there were no little wilting lilies there.
I do. I like to write about strong women. I mean, one thing that I've noticed as I read and research is women were strong. I mean, women who came out to this area, if they weren't strong, they didn't last very long.
Exactly.
It just was a very difficult life. And so you had to be strong. And given what they were responsible for, they had to be very strong. I guess I come from a family of strong women. So
there you go.
I like and appreciate that.
And you also have is it a Christmas series, or there was a Christmas book? I was looking at.
Yes, I have a few Christmas books out, but the one I think you're talking about is a Christmas collection, a Mail Order Bride Christmas collection.
That's right.
Yes. And that's two books that I wrote that actually are set in the same town that my first steam book is set in, but only like 30 years later.
Oh, okay.
So,
Okay.
you know, it's just kind of what I did was I began to write into this series called American Mail Order Brides, and it's actually a multi-author series. And I kind of started by starting a book in that series, and then I just kind of went on from there and did a few more of the Mail Order Bride. So I have several. I have the American Mail Order Bride series. I also have something called The Bride Train, which again spins off from a little story in my first steam book about brides being brought out west by the railroad, who thinks that, you know, if we can get these settlers to get married, they'll stop being so demanding and difficult.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So that's kind of, you know, precipitated that series. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's fun. So they're sort of couched as romance. I wasn't quite sure when I was reading the Tom and Huck books. I mean, there's definitely a love story there, but you in those, there's no steamy parts or anything like that. Are you? That's not your style.
Not for those particular books.
No.
And you know, to me, they are much more than romances.
Yes.
You know, there's much more to those books, the relationships that are involved and the stories and the plot lines and things like that.
Yeah.
They do end happily and there is a love story, but as people have said, well, they're just not typical romances. No, they're not.
No, exactly.
You know, they're meant to be a lot more. They're meant to be kind of a take on, you know, what happened to these guys.
Yeah. And,
you know, let's try to be true to these characters. And if I can be as true as possible to these characters Twain created and honor him in that, then let's just take them where they will go.
Yeah.
Where might they go? You know, what is Huck Finn looking for? Right. Well, I think that young man is looking for home and a place to belong. You know, I can imagine that that's what's in his heart. But how does he find it when he values his freedom so much?
Right.
And with Tom and Becky, you know, how do they find, how do they grow into each other? You know, they become very different people, and they have to find their way back to loving each other and actually find their way to loving each other, because, you know, they're not children anymore. You know, they're grown-ups, and there's all these things that are kind of in their way. And, you know, and a Tom Sawyer fella, it is not going to be easy to love a guy like that.
Right.
And so, you know, it takes kind of a special person to be able to stick with that guy. And so that's kind of how I approached that, was more from a relationship story. And, you know.
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, and I know you said they took about 10 years to write Huck Finn, which is kind of what happened to Mark Twain. Huck Finn he started and then tucked it away. It just wasn't speaking to him. And I think I'm trying to remember from my guide days, that's when he was invited to go out west to do something. And it wasn't until, when he brought it out. Once he started again, it was a much different book after.
Yeah, it really was. And it's interesting to read about the process he went through in writing that. And it did evolve. You know, my book evolved too, just like his book evolved a lot, you know, and kind of was influenced by going back, rethinking it, you know, that kind of thing. Yes.
So those two, they are huge characters. How long does it usually take you to write a book? Not the Tom and Huck ones, but some of your other books. Does it vary?
You know, it's probably about a year. If I put all the time into it that I'm talking about, where I, you know, research it, write it, revise it, rewrite it, you know, edit it, rewrite it. You know, I mean, if I go through the whole process, it can be anywhere from 6 months to a year for me to get, especially a novel. A novel's going to take me longer. The novellas that are about half the size, about 6 months, you know, something like that. But, you know, there for a while, I was getting more than one book done per year. I was sort of on a, you know, I had some momentum going. I slowed down a little bit, but I think mostly because these were the two books that I wanted to get out, and I just slowed down and worked on them for a while and didn't let anything else distract me.
That's terrific. I lost my train of thought, but and as you're writing, and again, we set aside Tom and Huck because there's did these characters just come to you? Or are they people that are talking to you that you want to get down on paper?
Oh wow, you know, a lot of times characters do come to me that way, where they're just there, they're just kind of baked. These characters existed, many of them already in another author's head. So what I did was try to the extent possible, learn as much as I could about what Twain had written about them, and about himself. And try to kind of figure out how much of him is really baked in here, and how much do I want to try to reflect of that. So his life on the Mississippi informed a lot of how Huck perceives himself as a steamboat pilot. But Huck's on a different river. So I went and found a diary of a steamboat pilot who plied the Missouri River, who actually served with Sam Clemens for a time on another boat. So he was a peer of his. He was. I don't think they were close, but he was a very well-known pilot. His name was Grant Marsh. He was on the Missouri. And so he was so good at what he did, he probably would have been the one who trained someone who became a good pilot. So I thought, well, that's kind of like Twain was trained. He was apprenticed. Huck is apprenticed by this man on the Missouri River. And so, reading the pilot's diary just gave me real insight into the perspectives of pilots and what they're like, and how they, just kind of the adventurous souls that they had, and really how brave and courageous they are. And yet how practical.
Well, yes.
So it's those characters I got into reading and thinking about, and noodling about, making notes about, and the characters I couldn't figure out anything from just reading. I just sat and thought about, what about these relationships, what makes sense to me? Why do two boys who are brothers, even half brothers, why are they so resentful of each other? What would have brought them to that point? How'd they end up with Aunt Polly?
Exactly.
So I had to make all this stuff up. So I was just like, okay, well, I'm going to come up with a plausible explanation of all that.
That's great. And as I was reading them, of course, I started thinking, I got to go back to the originals. I got to go back to Twain's books, because I didn't remember this, or I wasn't quite sure where that came from, because I don't feel as close to him. It's been a few years since. So that's also another wonderful little thing. So everyone, you have a website, Burke, and it's BURKE.com. Where you can find all this kind of information that we've been talking about. But most importantly, you can go to marktwainhouse.org and register for Romancing Mark Twain. And it's kind of fun on your website. He was a very romantic man. He loved his wife. He idolized her. And of course, he was so good with words. His love letters are just so charming.
They're adorable. I know.
I'm so sorry that you're not able to come to the Twain house and do it there. That's definitely in your future.
It is in my future. I intend to get out there if I can this year. I would love to come out there. I really, really would.
It's a jewel of a place. It really is so much fun. So Romancing Mark Twain at the Mark Twain House, February 15th from 7 to 8 o'clock. It is free. You can always throw a donation there if you would like to. And hear more about Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn all grown up.
Yes. And more about Twain and his love story with Livy. And Rebecca's going to pull out some letters, and we're going to be talking about that. It's going to be so much fun to see kind of how does that compare a little bit, with sort of the love stories that I came up with.
Yeah. So. Rebecca is so knowledgeable. So there'll be a lot to learn, a lot to listen. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. And I hope to be, I will be down in the Florida Keys, but I can be with you virtually. So that's kind of nice on the 15th.
That'll be great. I hope so.
Yeah, great. So break a leg with that. All right, everyone. We're going to go to a quick break, so don't go far. You're listening to Spotlight on WLIS and WMRD.